Hello and welcome to our weekly share. Where this year we're doing the Torah of Kelm. Obviously, it was Kelm, and last week we focused on Pesach. That was part one. This week we are going to do part two. Next week, before I fly off to for Pesach to Phoenix, Arizona. Yeah, I knew I was going somewhere. Then I'm going to do a slightly different share, and I hope you will find this useful. I'm going to basically take little pieces from all my favorite parts of the Haggadah and favorite commentators on those parts, so that you will have a potpourri, a collection of things that hopefully you'll be able to enjoy and apply and use at your own Seder table. So that's a slight departure from our normal approach, but I thought it'd be nice to do that for Pesach as well. However, we're going to do part two of last week's share. Before I sum up and summarize what we said last week, let me just do our normal dedications. And before I do that, let me just tell you that if you would like to have the share dedicated for somebody who is celebrating some nice Jewish simcha, a bar mitzvah, a wedding, of course for Yortzai, or for somebody, as we're about to do, who is not been well and needs a refuah shalima, then please get in touch with me at askrabbiyyy.com, yy at askrabbiyyy.com, and I will be more than happy to dedicate the share to the person that you would like it dedicated to. So where was I up to? Oh yes, so our list of people who we are hoping that the share will help them on their road to recovery. Let's start with Rafal Chai Ben Sora, my very dear young friend in Manchester who is recovering from illness. He should do well. And then how about talking about Oria Chaim Ben Chana Yehudis, the little boy who's waiting for the lung transplant. And then there's Amram Ben Sora, the young man who became not well from an unexpected blood infection, but now is out of hospital. Yecheskel Yehuda Ben Yenta, cousin of mine in Eretz Yisrael, should go Mechoil El Chayil El Choil, from strength to strength in his. Now he's come home after a 6-month stay in hospital and major surgery. I'm sure. Oh yes, my dear wife, Ita Rif, we got Sima Esther, should have a continued refuah shlema after 2 knee replacements, and I think that's all. Hope I've not forgotten anybody. Right, so let's move on with the share. So last week in the share, if you remember, we had been asking the question, who were the Erev Rav? And by looking at the Alshich and by looking at the language of the Medrash Rabbah, both who said that Moshe Rabbeinu argued with Hashem when he reprimanded him for taking out the Erev Rav, Moshe used strange language. He says, isn't it a good idea to bring back those lost souls to Kedusha? And the lost souls, obviously, if you lost something, it was already there. And another version of this Medrash Rabbah says that he said, isn't it a good idea to bring back people who are returning? And again, if you returned, you've been there before. So I wanted to say in the share that the Erev Rav were the souls of the 10 generations, because the Jews were in Egypt for 210 years, the 10 generations who were seduced, intentionally seduced into Egyptian society, into idolatry, chose to abandon Torah and mitzvahs. In fact, the first mitzvah the Jewish people abandoned was the mitzvah of Bris Milah, which is why on the night of Passover, then there was 2 bloods smeared on the doorpost. One was the blood of the Korban Pesach, the Passover sacrifice, and the other was the blood of Bris Milah. The Jewish people were demonstrating that they were returning to their roots. But they were sucked or plucked from those roots intentionally as a strategy by Egypt, in order to get them to give up mitzvahs, knowing that if the Jewish people tell Hashem, we're not interested anymore in your protection, then Hashem will remove that protection, making them fair game and easy targets for Egypt. 10 generations were lost. Where were they? So we said that they came back as the Erev Rav. These were the Jews who came back from the Erev Rav. And that's more or less where we left it last week. We also said that the Chofetz Chaim, in his commentary on Parshas Mishpatim, says that there is a concept of lost Jews throughout all of the ages. He uses the biblical metaphor of lost sheep. And he says that there is a mitzvah in the Torah, as indeed there is, that if you see your neighbor's lost sheep, lost cattle, there's a mitzvah to go and return these sheep. And it says that the Chofetz Chaim, without any direct mystical connections, more of a logical one, if the Torah is concerned about the mere material possessions, the animals of your neighbor getting lost, how much more so, Kal v'chomer, is Hashem concerned about the actual souls, the Jewish souls, the sheep, his flock, the flock of Hashem, who have got lost. Surely, how much more is there a responsibility on us to reach out and bring those souls back again? So if you do, he says, you deserve a proper title. And the proper title would be Roy Yisrael, the shepherds of Israel. Now, of course, Moshe Rabbeinu is himself a shepherd for 40 years. And if we had more time, which I'm trying to keep this short, there's a reason why Moshe Rabbeinu was a shepherd. In fact, there's a reason that all of the Ovos, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, David HaMelech, Moshe Rabbeinu, that being a shepherd was such a critical, an intentionally critical role that they chose for themselves. But part of the metaphor of the shepherd is to bring back lost souls, which is going to be, in the case of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, in the founding of the Jewish people, David HaMelech certainly, and of course, ultimately Moshe Rabbeinu, their critical role. Okay, so that's where we left off. Where were those 10 generations who were lost in Egypt? They were found again, and they were returned by Moshe Rabbeinu as the heir of Rav. Fine. Now, in Parshas Tetzaveh, there is an incredibly interesting Orach Chaim HaKodesh. And the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, as you know, of the Rishonim was only 5 called HaKodesh, and the Orach Chaim was one of them. The Alshich, my favorite commentator, he was another. And then there was the Shlo HaKodesh, the Ari HaKodesh, and the one that people always forget about, Rashi HaKodesh. But the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, and this is in Parshas Tetzaveh, right at the beginning, his first commentary, says 2 things which I think are going to be extremely important for us in this our second share of Pesach. And he says the following thing. He quotes the Tikkuni Zohar. And the Tikkuni Zohar, if you're interested, is Tikkun Mem Tes, Samach Tes. And he says, Kikol Talmud Chochem yesh lo nitzas minishmas Moshe. Every Talmud Chochem has a little spark of the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu in him. He's really saying, because of course the Parsha of Tetzaveh starts with Ata Tetzaveh, you will command the Jewish people. It doesn't say, and Moshe, B'Yadav Hashem and Moshe, command the Jewish people. Of course, that's a given. But in just saying, and you will command the Jewish people, is speaking to all the, as it were, little Moshes. Like a bit like these Russian Matryoshka dolls. I don't know how to pronounce that properly. Matryoshka, I think. Matryoshka dolls. You know, the dolls, the nesting dolls, I think they call them. And when they come out, etc., a tiny one. Well, this tiny one, every Talmud Chochem is a tiny doll from Moshe Rabbeinu, as it were, a tiny replica of Moshe Rabbeinu. So he says, Kikol Talmud Chochem yesh lo nitzas minishmas Moshe, has a tiny residue of the soul of Moshe Rabbeinu within him. But the Rabbi say, Moshe. And that's why the Gemara says in Shabbos and Kuf Aleph on base that they call each other, the rabbis call each other Moshe. It's a metaphor, a euphemism for this fact, this idea that you are a leader of Klal Yisrael. And indeed, you have the original, some residue of some element of Moshe Rabbeinu within you, which makes sense. Because after all, you've learned Torah, you've learned Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah. So if you teach somebody Torah, it's as though you are his father, he is your father, and you're his son. Same idea. But turning 2 pages in this fashion, here is the Orach Chaim who quotes another Zohar Chodesh. Zohar Chodesh in Ches Aleph, Ki Hashem and Dalet Goli, Shal Yisrael. There were 4 exiles of the Jewish people, right, as we know, classic 4 exiles. When Yaakov has a dream and the angels are going up and down the ladder, up and down. These are the angels of the four exiles, and the number of rungs on the ladder, steps in the ladder that you go up is a number of years which they would dominate the Jewish people. So he says, of the four exiles, in the schus and the merit of one of four people, the Jewish people were able to free themselves from that exile. And who are they? The first exile ended in the schus of Avram. The more the Jewish people were like Avram, the more they were able to get out from that exile. Base Yitzchak. This the nature of Yitzchak, the schusim of Yitzchak, were able to rescue the Jewish people from the second exile. The schus Yaakov, the third. But what about the fourth one? That's the one that we're in now, the longest one of all, the 2,000 year and counting one, Golus Edom, this massive anti-Semitic one. This schus Moshe. This one is going to end in the merit of Moshe. In Moshe Chayfetz L'Goel Al Batlonis Minatera. And because this exile has gone on so long, Moshe, as it were, is not standing up and advocating for us in Shemayim because we have not, I'll read to the Hebrew again, this has gone on so long for the simple reason, as long as the Jewish people are not engaged with Torah and mitzvahs, in Moshe Chayfetz L'Golas Aim Batlanim Minatera. Therefore, it's only when we are learning Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah and engaging in Moshe Rabbeinu's Torah and his mitzvahs as he wants us to, and remember what we just said from the Tikkun Zohar before, as Moshe Rabbeinu did, because it's got to be you're doing it like him, that will he stand up and say, yes, they deserve to get out. That rather goes very nicely with what the Chofetz Chaim said from a logical point of view, and that is to say, if Hashem is concerned about sheep, who are literal sheep, then the sheep, these souls, these Jewish souls that get lost, and of course he's going to be concerned because Moshe Rabbeinu is concerned, and therefore we should be concerned for them as well. So just put that aside for the second. To understand this a little bit better, let me take you to an insight into Moshe Rabbeinu. Now, if we had lots of time, I would take you to the Gemara and Shabbos and Lamed Beis, in which Moshe Rabbeinu is defending the Jewish people for the making of the golden calf, when Hashem says, I'm going to destroy them and start again with you. And Moshe Rabbeinu fights, literally fights, and that's not me saying so. The Gemara there, it says, the Moshe fights, and fired his words, is the language of the Gemara, like arrows towards heaven, and says things like, Rabban Shalom, who made them? You made them, and you created with them a Yetzer Hara. If you hadn't created the Yetzer Hara, then they wouldn't have done this. So whose fault is it? Or, he says, aren't they compared to clay, another metaphor for the Jewish people? If the pot, which the potter has thrown, has crafted, is wobbly and not nice, flawed, then who created it? Whose fault was it? The clay's fault or the potter's fault? Clearly, the potter. And of course, he's talking about Shem Yisbarach, firing his words at Shemayim. Now, this is very, very important. Of course, as we said last week, we saw that Moshe is arguing with Hashem, as that Medrash said. When Hashem says, I told you not to say them out. And Moshe turns around and says, but didn't you say your hand's always open to bring in lost souls? Isn't it a good thing? Didn't you teach it was a good thing to bring these people back to Kedusha? And of course, obviously, Hashem smiles. Hashem knows that Moshe is going to make those arguments and knows what those arguments are before Moshe makes them. So therefore, he knows they're valid arguments. So why does he say or threaten to destroy the Jewish people in the first place? Let me repeat that. It's important. If Hashem knows, of course Hashem knows everything before it happens, he's not bound by time as we are. There's no past, present, and future. If he, in our terms, if he can see into the future, if he can hear Moshe Rabbeinu making the argument before Moshe Rabbeinu makes the argument, and he knows it's a valid argument that will, Yochel, as it were, persuade him, then he's already persuaded. So why on earth is this whole dialogue playing out if Hashem's already convinced by Moshe's argument? And the answer is to allow Moshe to make the argument. So that Moshe makes the argument to teach us that to be a Moshe, or to be a Talmud Chacham who teaches Moshe's Torah, or to be a generation who wants to get out of a terrible exile that lasted 2,000 years, you have to have the attitude when it comes to Torah and mitzvahs of Moshe Rabbeinu, and want to bring back lost souls, and want to reach out to bring out people, even if they were completely betrayers of every Jewish value, had become Egyptians. Even if it's in these reincarnated souls, as we saw from Rabbi Dessler last week, you're going to still try and bring them back. So here's another example of this. This is a very interesting example indeed. It's Gemara in Sanhedrin. I quote this often in my share. I think it makes me very, very excited, actually. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin is on page 101b, Kuf Aleph base. And it's talking about how the babies in Mitzrayim, where the babies were thrown into the gaps left in the walls that the Jewish people had not finished properly. Why did they put the babies into the walls? It was simply as a punishment. I mean, obviously, a baby's not going to perform the role of a missing brick. Human bodies turn to dust eventually. It was a punishment for the parents. I'm going to kill your children in a horrible way, and you'll watch them dying if you don't fulfill the tally that we have set for you for that day's work. Anyway, so basically, of course, it says that they were into the holes in the walls. But it's machmech b'binyan, and their souls were squished in there. And this is Rashi. Rashi says here a very interesting thing. This machmech b'binyan, shah mitzrayim shenis haba b'binyan b'mokem alavenim. That Rashi says, just as I just quoted, that the babies were put into the spaces left by the bricks. Can mafarish b'agada, as it says in the Medrash, and it doesn't say which Medrash, and I've looked many years for this Medrash, can't find it. So anyway, Sha'amar loy Moshe LaKadosh Baruch Hu, and Moshe said to Kadosh Baruch Hu, Atari Oisa La'am Hazeh. This is the famous pasuk at the end of the book of Shemais. Moshe comes and challenges Hashem. Moshe sent Hashem to demand of Paro the freedom of the Jewish people, and Paro, instead of capitulating and making things better for the Jewish people, makes things profoundly worse, and therefore Moshe challenges him. Atari Oisa La'am Hazeh. But now that they don't have enough straw, remember, Pharaoh's reaction to Moshe's demand is to make things worse for the Jews by not giving them the straw that they used for the making of the bricks. Not they didn't have that. Now they didn't have that, and they had to go and gather themselves. They couldn't fulfill the amount that was demanded of them daily, and consequently, the babies put into the walls. And Moshe protests. And he said, why have you done that? This is the answer that Hashem gives to Moshe. Moshe Babinyan, Amalai Kadosh Baruch Hu, cuts him. I know what I'm doing. I am not bound by time. You just see a crying baby, but I know that these particular babies, these specific babies that you're talking about, and we've got no idea how many it was. Maybe just setting an example, it might have been only one or two, or it might have been one or two. 100 or 10,000, I'm not sure. However, Hashem says, I know that those babies will grow up to be kaitzim, thorns in the side of the Jewish people. Kaitzim machlin shagol lefana, because damage. It's clear to me, if they were to have lived, they'd have grown up to be evil and consequently affected badly other people. And if you want, you can go and take one of them. So he went to take out one of the babies. This baby was somebody called Micha, who grew up to be indeed a Rosha, an idolater, who set up an idolatrous shrine in Israel. And not only that, and this is an irony, when he recruited two priests to serve at his shrine to idolatry, the people who answered the advertisement were Moshe Rabbeinu's grandsons. Moshe Rabbeinu's grandsons were corrupted by Micha, the person that he saved. And there's an irony there. So that's the point. Now, let's consider this thing that I've just read to you, and that is compared to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu would need a telescope to see spiritually, and Y.Y. Rubinstein, you would need an electron microscope to see spiritually. And yet, I have to tell you that if Hashem said to me, if I was upset about something, tzaddik for Raloi, the classic question, why do bad things happen to good people? And there's nobody more good than a baby. And if Hashem said, oh, I know that these are going to grow up to be really, really bad people who will do a lot of damage, I know what I'm doing, then me, the spiritual amoeba, would turn around and say, okay, I mean, Hashem knows what he's doing, but Moshe Rabbeinu, the galactic figure, says no. When Hashem says go and save one, he goes and saves one. Why does he do that? Hashem's told him it's going to grow up to be bad people. In this case, ironically so. Why didn't he let it go? There's another, so the answer to that, I think, and this is very, very critical for where we're going in this Shia, you'll find in the Gemara and Brochas and Daf Yud Amud Aleph. The Gemara and Brochas and Daf Yud Amud Aleph says the following thing: B'yom Mahim, in those days, Cholach Chizkiyahu Olamovas, the great king, Jewish king Chizkiyahu, was terribly ill, about to die. V'yavoli Yeshua ben Omas, and Yeshayahu, Isaiah the prophet, comes to see him. V'yomer Elov Kamar Hashem, so it's always, and the Almighty says, Tzav lebesecha, attend to your affairs, write your will. Ki mesatov is going to die, and you're not going to live. Strange phrase. You're going to die and you're not going to live. Generally, people who die don't live. So why is that a double expression? What does that mean? You're going to die in this world, and you're going to die in the world to come as well. You're getting no world to come. Amarle, to which Chizkiyahu said to Yeshayahu, the prophet, Michael Lihai, what have I done to suffer such a severe punishment, such a horrible punishment as that, a comprehensive punishment, losing both worlds? The answer is because you didn't get married. In order to have children, you didn't get married. You forsook the mitzvah of having children. The king Chizkiyahu replies to the prophet, and this gives you an insight into what sort of spiritual level Chizkiyahu was on. I saw through my Ruach HaKodesh, my divine inspiration, I was going to have sons who were no good nicks, as they say in Yiddish, who were indeed going to do a lot of damage. To which, and this is famous, in the calculations, says the prophet to the king, in the calculations of God, why are you getting involved? If that's what's going to happen, that you're going to have sons who are going to be abandon Judaism and not only that, embrace Avodah Zarah, etc. And of course, he's talking about Menashe and Melech Yisrael, who did precisely that. That's God's business. He deals with the future generations, with the future in its entirety. You don't. Your job is to deal with the present. In the world that you're in and the present that you're in, the Torah demands of you that you have children, and you decided not to have children. That's tremendously interesting. So his reasons for not having children was because the children would be bad people. And that's not a Jewish position to take. And he accepts that. So he says to him, so he says to me, okay, in that case, give me your daughter as a wife, and I'll have children. If that's the point, good. Sure, maybe that her skills, her merits, her saintliness, and combined with mine, nafka money bonim, we'll have children who will grow up. You're not listening to me, King. I've just told you, I'm a prophet. This already told me in heaven that the death the warrant for your execution has already been signed and sealed. You're toast. You're finished. Omle ben Omas, as the king says to the prophet, using his second name, Ben Omas, Yeshayahu ben Omas, like Rubinstein. Um, ignore your prophecy. And ignore and go here. I have a tradition from the Beis of my grandfather. Even if the sword of the axe is resting in your neck, you should never despair of the possibility that you will have a reprieve and you'll be saved. And indeed, that's what happened. All of it. He did marry his daughter. They did have children who were no good, etc. But that's not your calculation. Your calculation, our calculation, is to do what we're supposed to do in our lifetimes. And if you're supposed to save a baby in the wall, oh, but the Rabban says, I see. This was the same argument. Hashem says, I see that these children are not going to be no good. But this other Gemara, the Gemara we just looked at in Brocha, says, what Hashem sees behind the Kasha Drachman Alamalach. But that's nothing to do with me. Yes, Rabban Hashem, but that's not my calculus. That's not my metric. I have to figure out what I'm supposed to do. And in your Torah, it says that I have to save babies. I have to save Jews. Oh, that they're going to go on to do terrible things. That's not my calculation. Which takes us exactly back to where we started. So when Moshe Rabbeinu said, where we were up to last week, when Hashem rebukes Moshe for taking out the heir of Rav, Moshe Rabbeinu argues, as we said, with him. And if you look there at the commentary inside of the Medrash Rabbah, Eitz Yosef, he says that Hashem said, of course I knew what the heir of Rav were going to do, and the heir of Rav were going to create an Egel Azov, a golden calf, and do tremendous damage to the Jewish people, which of course was right. But that, this is the language that is astonishing, but that, my foreknowledge, was insufficient to gainsay your argument. I couldn't possibly deploy that to you. Why not? Because you'll deploy back to me. Even if that's true, even if you tell me that, that's nothing to do with me. The way that Hashem sees things is not the way I see things. I'm not supposed to try and look at the world the way that Hashem sees things. My job is to get on with acting as a Jew through my eyes, not through Hashem's eyes. Once the Torah is given in Har Sinai, famous argument, once the Torah is given in Mount Sinai, that is our compass, that's our GPS, that sets the direction of our lives, nothing else. And the Torah says, if you can save a life, save a life. If you can save these souls in Mitzrayim, save these souls in Mitzrayim. And just moving towards the end of this short shir, Rabbi Dessler is supposed to be Shiva's Kelm, and Rabbi Dessler, this is Rabbi Dessler. Of course, anybody who's ever studied Rabbi Dessler, which I'm sure many of the people watching this will know that he was extremely interested in the topic of Bechira. In page 111 in the Chelik Aleph, he talks about it. You'll find that's his first essay in Bechira, probably the most famous thing of all the Rabbi Destas that are quoted. Then later on in the Sefer, can't remember the page number, his second essay in Bechira. And you'll find a third and a fourth, you'll find in Chelik Daled. And indeed, in Chelik Hey, he comes back to Bechira again. So here in page 95, in Chelik Daled and Michtav Eliyahu, he raises a classic question. And he raises it by quoting the Ramban. And the Ramban at the beginning of the page is Ramban's commentary in Bereshis. It's a classic question. Can human choice defeat what Hashem wants to happen? Now that's why, and again, going back to our Chaim is very, very fundamental and indeed controversial in this. The reason that the brothers of Yosef put Yosef in the pit and didn't kill them themselves, which was their first idea, was, and the argument against it deployed by, I think it was Yehuda or maybe Reuven, I can't remember, was if we kill him, there'll be no way of knowing whether indeed, even though we think that he deserves to die, even though we formed a Beis Din, even though we paskin the Ischai Misa, there's no way of knowing that God really wanted him dead if we kill him. Whereas if we put him in a pit, which is full of snakes and scorpions, as that one was, and they kill him, that's definite, God wanted him dead. But if it's a human being's choice, a human being's choice can obviously do things that God doesn't want to have done. That's why it says, don't kill in the Torah, and you're not allowed to murder, because people can murder. People have freedom of choice. So freedom of choice would seem to be something that can even defeat what Hashem wants to happen. At the beginning of the Sefer here, of this essay here, in page 93, in Kuntres Bechira Gimel, he quotes two statements of the Ramban, which I'll read to you. A person chooses his own life and his own actions. As the Pasuk says, and another Pasuk, Mishiel, and we just quoted a minute ago, he was having a fight with King Chizkiyahu. And a person chooses their life and what paths it takes. That's number one. So that seems to be we have carte blanche to choose whatever we do in our life. But on the other hand, and there was a much larger paragraph with more proofs, nothing happens to us in our lives unless Hashem wants it to happen to in our lives. That seems to be a bit contradictory. Is the person the chooser? The guy with the gun who pulls the trigger, was he the person who chose his victim's death? Or was he merely the vehicle through which Hashem acted? Because Hashem wanted the person's death. And if Hashem wanted the person's death, then why should the person who pulled the trigger be in any way responsible? The Ramban brings two contradictory positions and says they're both right. Elu ve'elu, divrei Elokim chayv. Even if you find two completely contradictory positions, one black, one white, then they can both simultaneously be correct. How can it be? Now, this, I have to tell you, that famous Orach Chaim, a couple of years ago, my Morning Professor, Rabbi Yitzchak Young, a serious Talmud Chacham, and I decided to go into this in some depth. I think we spent 6 weeks. So that's 6 days a week, 6 weeks, going through this in great depth, looking at the Rosh Gesed of Ron Gurwitz, he has the same subject, Rabbi Dr. Akiva Tatz, a brilliant mind, and all the way back to the primary sources. And we were still sort of scratching our heads. However, there's a Rabbi Dessler here in Chelik Dalad, page 95, which gives an insight into this. So he says the following thing. Now, there's a lot of perhaps knowledge that a person should have as the background from Rabbi Dessler's first essay in Bechira. But basically, the point that Bechira works is the point where the negative side of your nature and the positive side of your nature clash. You know something's wrong and you know something's right, and then you choose. If you don't know it's wrong, if you're brought up amongst a family of thieves and shoplifting is the way you were educated, then you're exercising no choice over that. It's only where your Yetzer Hara and your Yetzer Tov clash that you will, as it were, have choice. That's called his, famously, Nekudas of Bechira, the point in which Bechira acts. That's point number one. With that as a background, and I'm obviously missing out lots here, there's maybe another quick Rabbi Dessler from his essay in Rosh Hashanah. But there are 2 days Rosh Hashanah, even if you live in Israel, because there's 2 types of way that a Jew could escape punishment. One is in his own merits, that he or she is such a good person that they have deserved another year on the planet. Their trajectory is upward, and they're going to help lots of people, so let's keep them here. Or 2, they don't deserve anything in their own merit, but they do deserve merit because they're acting as a vehicle for Hashem to demonstrate his control of the world through them, and because of their interactions with somebody else who does deserve in their own right. For example, if somebody is not a very deserving Jew, but they're very rich and they are supporting a good Jewish cause, let's say yeshiva, because a Rosh Yeshiva obviously needs yeshiva, needs talmidim, needs money to support it, then it might be that the person is able to sustain himself through in a year due to his support of somebody who deserves that support. That would make sense. Or it could be that he would continue through the year in order to be punished so that people can see that somebody behaves contrary to Hashem, gets punished. But that's they're on the planet not because they deserve to be in their own right, rather because they are merely a demonstration of they are a vehicle through which Hashem can use. Now, Rabbi Dessler says the following thing, and this is the second paragraph, that it could be that, how could it be that evil people could carry on being successful when they don't deserve to be here. And go back to our previous question. If I have complete choice, then I press the trigger, it's my responsibility, and I'm guilty. Yeah. Or that I don't have complete choice and I'm merely the vehicle for Hashem. So he says an amazing, interesting thing here. And this fits in perfectly with what we are saying. And that is as follows. Imagine somebody who is in heaven. The scales, the verdict is literally perfectly balanced. As much reason for killing him or for not giving him another year or her another year as for giving him. And they can't, in the scales of justice in heaven are perfectly balanced. And Rabbi Desta says, and he brings all sorts of proofs, which we don't have time to go into, that it might be, it's conceivable that Hashem saying, I can't, as it were, the Beis Din in heaven, we can't really let him off the hook, but we'll put him into a situation where he'll be confronted by somebody else, another person whose Nakudas Habachira, his point of his choice, is whether or not to kill. Is killing a bad thing or a good thing? He knows that it's a bad thing, sort of. And he's going to make a choice. We can't find any reason to let him off the hook. He's done lots of bad things, but he's done good things as well. So it's perfectly balanced. We just can't, in all honesty, tip the scales in his favor. We will allow him to be confronted by somebody who will make the choice, a human being who will make that choice. His freedom of choice will be whether or not to kill this person or not, because it's 50-50 whether he should live or he should die. And because we can't, in all fairness, do it, but maybe he can, maybe he will choose. That's an interesting idea, because then, go back to what we said before, is the person completely in charge of choices? Yes. Can that choice, as it were, defy heaven? Yeah, because heaven doesn't really want him to die. Let's give it over to somebody else who might be able, through his choices, to save him. That's how Rabbi Dessler reconciles those two Rambans, the one that says it's got complete freedom of choice and one that says that he's only a vehicle. But if that's true, that fits perfectly with the idea of Moshe being the one who intervenes to save those souls who came out from Mitzrayim as the Erev Rav, those previously Jewish souls who left and abandoned Judaism, who are now fighting to get back in. And if it's the case that they're going to, in the future, do something terrible, well, she doesn't see that, can't see that. Hashem doesn't tell them that because it's not relevant. Moshe's calculus is, are they savable? And there's a possibility that they're going to be saved. He then becomes the person and give them life or death, just like the guy we said before can make that choice. And Moshe's choice is always to bring life if he can. Similarly, with the Erev Rav, I'll bring them life if I can. He did it to that baby in the wall. I'll bring them life if I can. And therefore, he brings them out. What's going to happen with them? I don't know, but that's not my worry. And that would explain very nicely what we said before. And as the Chofetz Chaim said, if you can save a Jewish life, then you should save a Jewish life. I can't not refer to something that happened just yesterday in Israel, the state of Israel, when there was a massive climax of the ongoing demonstrations by the people who lost the general election. They didn't get the majority, but they just would not accept the new government's legislation to amend and change the Supreme Court. I'm not going to get into that. And that's something which we know about. But here's another important point, and again, it comes from Rabbi Dessler. There was lots in social media, and lots of people are very disturbed by this, both sides of the debate. Those who see that the left has mounted effectively a coup d'etat and defeated a democratically elected government, and those who see them as being an illegitimately democratic government. And as I say, you can take your own side. But if you do, says Rabbi Dessler, you're wasting your time. You're arguing it from an olam hazeh perspective, a political perspective. as though that really matters. No, when something is as huge as this, which has been news all over the world, even the BBC, remarkably neutral in this one, well, sort of. When you see that the whole world is watching what Prime Minister Netanyahu and all the major politicians talked about the verge of a civil war in Israel, that's a big historical moment. Of course, we've been in civil wars before in the land of Israel with catastrophic consequences. And here we have got the exact same situation again. And you can look at it from a completely secular point of view, or you could, as Rabbi Dessa says that you should do in Chelik Aleph, you should look at it, and you must look at it from a religious point of view. When the Jewish people were, as it were, perched on the verge of getting the Ten Commandments and finishing the job that Hashem wants in the world, then at that moment, no need for Beis Hamikdash, no need for Mashiach. Moshe becomes the Mashiach, the world is perfected. Well, you don't think that the Yetzer Hara, the Satan, this angel whose job, this algorithm whose job is to disrupt and to sabotage all such moments, is sitting idly by. And of course, that's why he engineers through his most useful tools, his weakest tools, the ones who fell before the era, the collapse of that potential. I think you'd have to turn around and say, what is the real big picture of what happened yesterday? So here's a story. I heard a story that the leader from Amram Blau of the small group Naturi Karta once went to see the Rav of Brisk, the Rosh Yeshiva of Brisk. There was demonstrations on the streets of Israel by, as they say, ultra-Orthodox, I'm ultra-Orthodox, which is a pejorative term, by the way, Jews against something in the state of Israel, which of course Naturi Karta and many others don't really recognize. And he came to the Rosh Yeshiva Brisk, and he said that he should come and join in the protest. This is a machlokes l'shem shamayim. You should send your bochrim, empty your yeshiva, send the bochrim into the streets to demonstrate. To which the Rosh Yeshiva said to Ram and Blau, tell me, you and I are both from Poland, yes? Would you ever have entered your mind, even for a second, that we should go and demonstrate again outside the parliament in Warsaw against the policies of the Polish government? Well, of course it wouldn't enter your mind for a second. Why? It's not your country. But here you want to do it. So you're still a Zionist, huh? So you really are a Zionist. It was very, very clever. So are you looking at it, the situation in Israel, that it's a question of, I'm more like Amram Blau. I'm sort of like not the Zionist fellow. But I really believe that it's not going to be solved by demonstrations in the streets, these sorts of issues. There's a bigger agenda. There's a spiritual agenda going on here. And here's the question I would put to Rabbi Amram Blau, and which is our people who have that view. If my responsibility, as the Chofetz Chaim said, if my responsibility, as the Or Chaim said, is to follow in the footsteps of Moshe Rabbeinu and be concerned about every Jew and try and bring back lost Jews, no matter how far away they've gone, then the question really is, am I going to achieve that better by fighting in the streets? And which, logically speaking, would just cause the fissure between the religious and the non-religious to widen, or by davening for them, or by inviting them to shiurim, or by smiling at them, because I'm convinced that they and I are ultimately the same Jews. I think perhaps if that was the approach that Moshe Rabbeinu took in Mitzrayim to the 10 generations who were lost, and probably lost more profoundly and for more horrible and ugly things than maybe the secular Jews of Israel have found themselves lost with, maybe instead of confrontation, we should be looking to reach out, seek compromise whenever it's possible, and be as welcoming and non-provocative to their fragilities as we would expect them to be to ours. Anyway, that would be the end of my comment on the current world situation. But I think it's a seriously important point. We only get out of this exile by copying Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu was concerned about every Jew. I shall see you next week. A wonderful Shabbos.